God eftermiddag. Mitt namn är Adam Zweiman och jag är ansvarig för Timbros integrationsprojekt. Nu är inte det kanske direkt relaterat till postmodernism, men det är i alla fall jag som har jobbat med den här boken. Nu är det så, vissa kanske har läst den på engelska. Den är 10 år gammal nu, Explaining Postmodernism. Och den svenska översättningen som kommer ut nu, det var någon som sa till mig innan seminariet att den här borde kommit ut för länge sedan. Och det stämmer. Det här är en bok som borde kommit ut för länge sedan. Det är ett ämne som ju på något sätt tröskas i daglig kulturdebatt och idédebatt hela tiden. Men ingen har riktigt tagit sig an frågan från det perspektivet som Stephen Hicks har tagit sig an. Så jag är väldigt glad att vi kan släppa den här boken. Och jag hoppas verkligen att den här kommer stå sig i tid. För det gör den verkligen. Det här är ett tidlöst tema. Den behandlade på ett unikt och spännande sätt. Och för att få ut så mycket som möjligt av det här seminariet så har vi bjudit in Thomas Gyr som sitter här och författaren till Stephen Hicks. Och ni får väldigt gärna sätta igång. Så jag fel nu?
Thank you so much. I think we just changed languages here in order to be to go into the main language of the seminar. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. That's a bit of stylish, unstylish of me. No, in any case, let me thank you, Adam, for inviting me for this and for this seminar, to moderating it, but also for having me having introduced the explaining postmodernism, which I actually read in English in order to be prepared for the terminologies and it. And I'm also very in a way disappointed that I didn't read it before when it came, because it's a wonderful book and it's a very good read. And thank you so much for writing it, Stephen. So this seminar will have this following structure that Stephen will make a short introduction to the main thesis of his main thesis in the book, to what is postmodernism, why is it important to care about it, and what are the fallacies of postmodernism, if I might say so. And then I have some questions, and we will have a discussion on some of the main theses of the book, and at the end of the seminar, and we will go on for approximately an hour. I'm sure that there will be some questions or commentaries from the audience as well, and we'll try to indulge you as well towards the end of the seminar. But first, Stephen, please, the introduction that you promised to give for the main parts of the idea. And do not be satisfied with the introduction, because the book is once again a wonderful read. So don't be content with just hearing Stephen. Get the book and read it.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Adam and Timbro, for hosting it. It really is a great pleasure to be here. For this introduction, I understand I have 15 minutes, so I have 15 slides, and it's 1 minute right per slide, so we'll see how that goes. First, the question is, what is postmodernism? And the name is, by the movement, chosen carefully. Modernism means that it sees itself as positioning itself against modernism or after modernism. So the first question is, what then is modernism, such that the postmoderns see themselves as reacting against or arguing against, right, in some respect. So here, for example, Michel Foucault, perhaps the most famous of the postmodern thinkers, arguing that we live in historically pregnant times, that it's the end of an era, right? And the way he puts it here is saying that the deepest strata of Western culture have been exposed and are once more stirring under our feet. So Western culture for some centuries has been on a certain foundation, but that foundation is being subjected to an earthquake, right, or some sort of natural faults are causing it to crumble and break down. Richard Rorty, perhaps the most famous of the American postmodernists, arguing that as a postmodernist, what they're trying to do is figure out what we're supposed to do, right? Now that the two previous eras that dominated Western civilization, right, the age of faith, right, as he calls it, and the age of enlightenment, they both seem beyond recovery. So they are both, in Rorty's postmodern estimate, failures, intellectually and in terms of their cultural manifestation. And that's our postmodern predicament. Now, both Rorty and Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and all of the pantheon of postmodern thinkers will cite the Enlightenment as the intellectual framework that dominated modernism. Modernism is a historical era, but its intellectual self-identification was realized and institutionalized in the Enlightenment, broadly speaking, of the 1700s. So what I have here is a flow chart, right? And I'll just talk very briefly through it. But what distinguished the birth of modernism, according to most historians, is a transition from an era dominated by reliance on authority, reliance upon tradition, upon faith, upon being certain established texts. And what we find at the beginning of the modern era is an emphasis on reason, the great philosophers here being John Locke, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and others. And all of them are modern because they make reason fundamental, the capacity of the individual mind to come to know reality. And that then is a huge shift from an uncritical reliance on a preset set of dogmas or traditions that one is not going fundamentally to criticize. And the argument then is that from all of that, the entire modern project follows. For example, I didn't want that one. If you go down to the bottom there, science then is a consequence of the modern project. If you are committed to reason and trying to understand the world rationally, then it makes sense, as it did happen starting in the 1600s with increasing speed on through the 1700s, to see physics become a science, chemistry become a science, biology becomes a science, and so science as a prominent, deep feature of the modern world. It didn't exist 600 years ago, but nonetheless, that is a consequence of a deep commitment to reasoning. Science, then, if we apply it to inanimate objects, means engineering with the dramatic transformation of the world by the Industrial Revolution is part of the modern product. If we try to understand human beings ourselves through a rational lens, we get rid of traditional medicines, old wives' tales with apologies to old wives, astrological remedies, prayer, seeing things as perhaps punishments from God, and see the human being as part of the natural world, that we can understand how we work through cause and effect. Then you're going to get modern medicine and its transformation coming into existence. And you start to see that in the late 1600s, 1700s, and then again picking up steam. So reason, science, modern medicine, technology are fundamental features of modernism, and they are institutionalized in the Enlightenment. But there's also a value or a normative component to the modern world, a transformation that occurred there. If we take reason seriously, when we think that reason is something that goes on in each individual's mind, that we each have the capacity for reason, whether we choose to exercise it or not, that's of course up to us. But if reason is important, then it becomes important that each individual think for himself or herself, and that we start culturally to encourage people to think for themselves. We understand, of course, that people will, as individuals, come to have different ideas. There's going to be lots of debate and discussion, and people are going to come up with obnoxious ideas that we despise. But what that means also is we still have to respect that other person's coming up with different ideas and thinking through for themselves. And so when we disagree, we will have to disagree as reasonable people do, and that's by discussion, debate, trying to change people's minds. And so also individualism starts to become an important component in the early modern world. Now, if you start to take the individual seriously, instead of seeing people just as part of a class group or some ethnic alien other group and so forth, that has very serious economic implications and very serious political implications. And also in the modern world, it wasn't just revolutionary in the science or in the engineering, it was revolutionary in the economics and in the politics. So, for example, in the politics, the rise of liberalism, the breaking down of feudalism, Individuals, no matter what their original class membership, are free to move about the country, leave the country, go into whatever lines of work that they want, deal with other people, participate in the political process, run for office. Broadly speaking, we get the democratic, republican, free market, capitalist revolutions going on in politics and economics. Now, the dates are, of course, important here. In the 1600s, there's a philosophical revolution. By the end of the 1600s and on into the 1700s, you can see individualism and science as institutions prominent. The political and economic revolutions are occurring in the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution, and the birth of modern medicine also in the 1700s. And then those trends all carry on into the 1800s, the 1900s, and we have the modern world that we live in now. That is modernism. And the first thesis of postmodernism is, and this is in milder forms of postmodernism, that all of that is an unstable, philosophically, ultimately bankrupt intellectual system that got institutionalized, and it has led to all sorts of pathological negative results in current culture. That it's an unsustainable cultural enterprise because intellectually it is bankrupt. And then the more cynical versions of postmodernism are to argue that all of that really was a fraud and a cover story for a deeper understanding of what really goes on in society and so forth. But let me give you some intros here. One of the important points within postmodernism, we hear a lot about skepticism, about relativism, in literary forms about deconstruction. So here is Foucault really going after the Enlightenment project at its root, saying reason is a sham, reason is a fraud. And notice how strong this statement is, right? That it's meaningless to talk about reason. It's meaningless to say that we can talk meaningfully about truth, right? Or it's meaningless to believe that there is such a thing as knowledge. Those are all things that the Enlightenment took seriously, but they are all empty, just sounds coming out of people's mouths that carry no content. And this is then the skeptical strain. If we take seriously a cognitive skepticism, where is that going to lead us? Because clearly the Enlightenment was based on a very optimistic view that we could come to know something about reality. And so the first thing I want to put out there is that there was, and there still is within postmodernism, a very serious grappling with cognitive issues and epistemological issues, but from a very negative, skeptical standpoint. In my story, I trace things back to Immanuel Kant, on through a wave of irrationalist thinking that dominated particularly German philosophy in the 19th century, picked up steam in thinkers like Martin Heidegger in the early part of the 20th century, and then manifested itself in the postmodernists. And it's interesting that all of the major postmodernists will say, we are taking our cues from Heidegger, and they will hearken back to the 19th century irrationalist thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and then behind them stand Immanuel Kant. So I just have one quotation from Nietzsche here, arguing that really it's Kant who marks the turning point. I agree with Nietzsche on this point. If you want to understand why the skepticism came to dominate, it really is Kant's arguments that one has to grapple with. And for 2 centuries, philosophers and others have been grappling with Kant's arguments and reaching very skeptical conclusions. So epistemology certainly is important. Now there's a biographical point here that I want to make. One of the interesting things about all of the leading postmodernists, and here I've got 4 of them, Lyotard, Foucault, Rorty, and Derrida, they actually were all born within a 7-year span, right? Okay. So they are a part of it. They all came of age in the 1950s. They're all extremely smart. They all got PhDs, and they all got PhDs in philosophy. And a big part of their philosophical training was grappling with the cutting-edge theories of knowledge and the skeptical epistemology that was dominating philosophy, both in the continental tradition and in the analytic tradition in the 1950s. So that's one part of the analysis of the story. Where does all this skepticism and relativism and this idea that there's no truth, right, and so forth come from? There's a deep story there. The other part of the story that gets emphasized is politics. And here I have another American postmodernist, Frederick Jameson. He's kind of a neo-Marxist, but he has this very pregnant line here that wants to say that everything, right, in the last analysis, right, is political, right? And that picks up on the sense that with postmodernism, politics is always very close to the surface, or and sometimes it's explicitly, right, a matter of reading everything through a political lens, right? It's a politically critical discipline, and of course a very intellectually sophisticated one. But it's also a very interesting, narrow brand of politics that is typically brought to bear. And here, Jacques Derrida, a quotation from him mentioning deconstruction, which is kind of the literary application of postmodernism, saying that postmodernism, right, is from his perspective a political application. It's sort of an application to literature of a certain strand of Marxism, right, that it's part of a Marxist strategy, right, in some sense or other. And here the interesting thing is all of the major postmodernists of the first generation are not only from the left end of the spectrum, from a fairly narrow element of the left end of the spectrum. Foucault was a member of the French Communist Party. Derrida hung around with French communists and published in the journals, as did Jean-Francois Lyotard. In the American context, Richard Rorty is a social democrat, and obviously, you know, the spectrum shifts to some extent when you move over to the United States, but from the American context, he is about as left as you can go. And I would just put it to you, if you run through the top 30 or 40 most famous postmodernists worldwide, they all come from one end, right, of the political spectrum. So politics is in a way very important to postmodernism. And there's an interesting puzzle here that I want to put out, and that is, if we're skeptical, if we're relativist, if we don't think there's really truth, knowledge, and so forth, those which are very, of course, prominent postmodernist themes, then when people start doing politics, where should they end up? Well, they should be all over the map, right? If there's no truth, if it's just whatever, right, subjectively, right, you feel like, well, people feel all sorts of things when it comes to politics. You should find postmodernists all over the map, but you don't. They're coming from one part of the political spectrum. So my main thesis about postmodernism is that it's a combination of a certain political strategy joined with a philosophical strategy, right? It's a kind of left politics. It's not the only kind of left politics, but it's a left politics joined with a very skeptical philosophy. And again, I want to just say a few things about the 50s as important here. All of the first generation leading postmodernists were coming of age. They're all in their 20s, getting their PhDs in philosophy, but all of them are very engaged with far left politics in the 1950s. And if you're a leftist, the 1950s were a disaster, right, for you, right, politically. That was a great crisis decade for left thought, where the deepest thinkers are reacting to a certain set of crises and saying, what are we going to do next? We need a new strategy. The strategy we have been following for 1 century since the Communist Manifesto is not working. We need to do something different. Now, in hindsight, we know that the new left comes out of that. The shift to Maoism comes to that. Leftism splinters into a whole bunch of sub-movements in the 1960s. It was all born of the 1950s. And there are any number of fascinating history issues that are going on in the development of left politics that culminate in the 1950s. So I think grappling with that political movement is part of the understanding of where postmodernism, right, come from. Now, I only have a few minutes, so I just want to wrap up. I've been very negative here. And the argument, of course, is a deep argument. What do we think the nature of the world that we are living in? Is it a fraud? Is it a sham? Is it a world that we should be critically and unrelentingly negative against, as postmodernism typically is? Is it a mixed bag of good and bad, or is it a place where actually we have achieved a lot significantly in the last couple of centuries? And I just want to give a couple of pointers because I'm much more optimistic, right? So if we actually evaluate the track record of modernism and the Enlightenment, right? How have things gone? I'm just going to give you one set of gaps here. This is from Gapminder. I'm sure you all know, right? Okay, so it's a perfect. I use these charts all the time in my classes. I love Hans Rosling. I'm in the fan club, right, and so on. Okay. All right, so here what we have is income right across the bottom, life expectancy right on the vertical axis, and then this is in 1812. Those are all of the countries in the world, and then they're color-coded according to what continent, right, they are from. So that is to say, all of the countries in the world, right, people are average life expectancy in the 30s, right? That's what it had been for tens of thousands of years. That was the historical norm, right? And income, right, in the, what is that? The rich people in the world on average are earning between, or almost $2,000 a year, right? And everybody else is down there. All right, this is when the Enlightenment is being institutionalized. The Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, Free Market Revolution, the Democratic Revolutions, and so forth. What happens in 1 century? All right, that happens. Right, a significant number of countries. These are actually all of the European countries here, and these are the North American countries. My home country, Canada, right, trying to catch up to the United States, right, not doing too badly. And then one more century, that's 1912, just before World War I. This is 2012. Okay, that is awesome. All of the poor countries, these unfortunately are mostly African countries, but if you go back 200 years, all of the African countries that we go to now and we say the poverty is awful, life expectancy is awful in those countries, they are far, far richer and living far, far longer than the richest people were living 200 centuries ago. So that's some significance. This is just Sweden, life expectancy. This is life expectancy in Sweden in 1800. It's in the low 30s, right? This is life expectancy in Sweden as of about 5 years ago. That's a beautiful thing, right? Right. So my point is, right, we have made some progress. I think the Enlightenment gets some props, but it does depend on a certain philosophical understanding. Taking reason seriously, taking individualism seriously, taking science seriously, right, and so forth. So the stakes are high in understanding where the postmoderns are coming from. They do have some powerful arguments, they do have to be understood, but I also think they need to be combated. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let us start with the philosophical part, because we have now a marriage. You call it a marriage. I would have called it the bastard child between philosophy and politics. But this marriage of skepticism and socialism, or that, showing what you have showed about the Enlightenment, and showing also the progress in especially natural sciences and technology and medicine. How can you be skeptical in a sense of that you can't have objective knowledge of the outside world? Something I read very young, and I asked my philosophy teacher that, well, we cannot know das Ding im sich. We cannot know the thing in itself, the Kantian. Right. Well, synthetic insulin was discovered actually by the Chinese in 1957. Then obviously we are able to know things as if they are, because we can then produce them synthetically. Right. So what is the attractiveness of skepticism about the existence of the outside world and our knowledge of it, considering what you have showed? Okay,
so now you ask me to wear my postmodernist hat and defend. Right,
someone has to do it.
Okay, I would say two things. All right, good. By their fruits, right, shall you know them. So what you then say is, we take the scientific project, the pro-reason project, the pro-technology project, and we say it has been very successful because look at all of the wonderful things that have happened in just, from personal gadgets, right, like these and the cameras, right, and actually my being able to get on a plane, right, and come across the ocean, right, and be here and so forth. So all of the wonderful things, that shows that there is something to, right, behind the philosophy. One of the strategies of the postmoderns, and it's not exclusive to the postmoderns, is to say, yes, but with all of that science and technology come problems. So they might say environmental degradation, right? Or the creation...
But those are the practical consequences.
Well, but that was your initial argument, to say if you take the theory and judge it by the consequences, right? But then you just cite the good consequences. They will say there are bad consequences, and then you make a judgment call. Do the bad consequences outweigh the good consequences? And that's a delicate, or can be a delicate balancing act, trying to weigh them up. But they will come down on the side of saying no.
But try to introduce that thought to, for example, to an engineer, to say that, well, you cannot build this bridge because you don't know what reality is.
Right.
It's impossible to bridge over this chasm with concrete because you do not know. You must be skeptical about do you have knowledge about reality, and then you see the bridges and they are actually functioning.
Right. So the second thing is then to say that, and this is the other part of what I was going to say, is that the postmodernists are by and large an academic movement. Right, and what is characteristically true of academic movements is that they don't talk to engineers. Right?
Well, I haven't met any. I'm actually married into an engineering family,
yes,
and they are not
Right.
postmodernists. Let me.
I almost became an engineer.
I can vouch
so
on
yes,
that.
That's right. No, but the way it typically works, of course, is intellectuals do spend much of their life in their heads, right? And we do know that it is an occupational hazard to get inside a theoretical framework and to see everything through that intellectual framework. And what that typically means is that you're just not interested in certain things. Academics are not typically worldly people, so that doesn't enter their first level of filter. But then we also do know that people, when they commit to a way of thinking about the world, other filters get easily put into place. And things that are uncomfortable data, it's more easily possible for them to just be set to the side. But then what they will typically do, and this is where the epistemological issues become very important, is to say, look, maybe in a rough and ready way, these scientific theories, if they're applied, can lead to some technical things. And they do seem to work right for the short run, right, and so forth. But we can't be generalizing or turning these things into firm principles, because then inside my head as a postmodernist, I'm very skeptical about generalizing and going to principles. They will say, for example, all of the engineering rests on a certain amount of science, right? But then if we look at the science, it depends on scientific method. But scientific method depends on a certain conception of the nature of observation, on the nature of mathematics, on the nature of logic. And then you drill in and you look at perception and you reach very skeptical conclusions about perception, and you reach skeptical conclusions about math and skeptical conclusions about logic. And then inside your theoretical world, right, the logic is then, so to speak, going to follow and say, well, we have to be uncertain even about engineering if I think about engineering.
And then you discover irregularities in the orbit of Uranus, and then you find Neptune where you thought it would be.
Right.
So obviously the models work.
Right. Yeah, the other thing I would say, though, is this is not a thesis originally to me, but C.P. Snow, a British thinker about a half a century, wrote a famous short book called The Two Cultures. And what he was focusing on is in the intellectual world, particularly by the beginning of the 20th century, there was a major split between the sciences and the humanities, right? To put it crudely, they went in very different directions, very different interests, very different vocabularies. And his thesis is that they just don't talk to each other, right, anymore. And I think that one indication of that is that postmodernists come out of a humanities tradition, and they just do not get a good science education. And I think they just don't know, right, a lot of these issues.
Well, let's go into the political part of postmodernism, the political parent of it. Socialism and the socialistic church also, both in its Marxist and also in its Leninist shape, was very much based on ideas of the Enlightenment as a part of the scientific tradition.
Yes.
I mean, actually, Friedrich Engels called it scientific socialism.
Yes.
So, and you showed the breach about, I mean, in a way, what happened, obviously, as I understand it, that the scientific predictions of scientific socialism were disappointments.
Yes.
Which led to that, in a way. So how did the left cope with it then? I mean, besides disappointment and...
Right. No, that historical point is exactly right. Marx and Engels, as they enunciated their version of socialism, it's the version of socialism that really dominated left thinking. There are other ones kicking around, but they really got marginalized for about a century, from 1850 up until about 1950 or so. And the label was scientific socialism. So in one respect, they did see themselves as a child of the Enlightenment, right? The world works according to certain natural laws that we can understand, and having reached an understanding, a social scientific understanding of the way the world works, we can make predictions, right, about how the phenomena are going to behave, right, in the future. So that part is exactly right. And then the second part of what you were saying is that, yes, part of the problem by the time we get to the middle part of the 20th century is that all of the major predictions of the classical Marxist model were not only just not coming true, but the exact opposite, right, of them seemed to be coming true. So, for example, Marx's slogan, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We've all heard that slogan. But what that predicts then is, in this brutal, competitive, capitalist struggle for resources that the Marxists describe the free market in terms of, you're going to have kind of successive rounds of competition. And what will happen then is some people will win and some people will lose. And the losers then will be forced into poverty. And then the winners will enjoy the spoils. But then, of course, the winners start to fight amongst each other. And then some of those then get forced into poverty. And then what you end up with is a very few capitalists at the top who are in control of all of society's resources. And the vast majority of people are forced into subsistence level, right, poverty. So that is the theory with a definite set of predictions. But then it becomes very clear as you get into the 20th century that it's not the case that we're having a smaller number of rich people right at the top of the heap. Instead, what happens is we have more and more rich people, right, developing in the free market capitalists. It's not the case that most people are being forced into poverty. And instead, what happens is the poverty rate is going down and people are being lifted out of poverty. They had also predicted that the middle class was this temporary class, that it was going to be squeezed out, right, by the free market competition.
The petty bourgeoisie will
That's
disappear.
right. Yeah, they would become even more petite, right? But what then, of course, was happening was the exact opposite of that. The middle class, right, was expanding. So as the social science data, right, came in, and it got better as the 20th century went on, then clearly the Marxists are looking at the data, they're looking at the theory. We are social scientists, and they're recognizing that there's a major mismatch between the theory and the practice. And so that is, I think, one of the things that by the time we get to the 1950s, people are rethinking after World War II what's going to happen next. The left is rethinking. We have to do something to the classical Marxist framework because it's just not working. So what do we do? Postmodernism is one of the variations that comes out of that.
So how come then the skeptical epistemological tradition or the anti-enlightenment epistemological tradition becomes so attractive for a movement that is trying to cope with its disappointment and failed predictions?
Yeah, that's one of the more controversial. This is one of the things I get more heat from, right, in my books, right? Because then the analogy that I make sometimes for explanatory at this point is to say, if you think of socialism, it's not just a scientific theory trying to understand the world, that it also is an eschatological theory. It's a theory of high idealism that if we commit ourselves to, we are going to transform the world and create, so to speak, heaven on earth. And so all of that religious language, I think, is important to understanding the psychology, right, of people who buy into the Marxist tradition. And there always then is a question, if you have a strongly held idealistic faith in something, it's part of the fiber of who you are. What do you do when the data and the arguments and the evidence seems to be against it? Right? So if you think of people who are very religious, but they're also intellectual and they think seriously about the arguments for and against the existence of God, and the rational side of their mind saying, I don't think I can defend my faith intellectually anymore. What do you do, right, at that very pregnant moment, right, inside your head? And you have a couple of strategies. One thing is to say, well, If the reason and the evidence and the logic are going against my faith, then I need to change my faith. Right? I need to get a different religion, become non-religious, right, or something like that. Because it's important to get the truth, and the way we get the truth is by looking at the data and the evidence. But we also know that the other strategy people can follow psychologically is if the evidence and the data goes against something that they really want to believe deeply, they will go on the offensive against reason, they will go on the offensive against logic, they will say everything is just semantics, nobody really knows the truth, right? That's just your interpretation. Right? That is to say, they bring in skeptical epistemological strategies or relativistic cognitive strategies, but it's a defense mechanism for a value system or a belief system that they want to hold dearly. And I do think that there's a lot of truth to that. There are true believers on the far left.
So when your constructions fail, you start to be a deconstructivist.
That's right. That's right. And so
instead of saying that we are creating a new earth and new heavens, actually, there is a Swedish author, Fredrik Ström, who wrote a five-series book called Rebellerna, the Rebels of the social democratic movement's growth in Sweden. The final book is Nya himlar och en ny jord, New Heavens and a New Earth, which is the social democratic Sweden created in the 20s, according to him. So when you cannot create anymore, then you have to be destruct, or deconstruct at least.
That's right. That's right. Then you become deconstructionist.
But then you deconstruct, and then also, I guess, you could become a bit of a relativist, in a sense that all cultures are equal. There is no, all truth is relative.
Yes.
And then you start to try to marry yourself into quantum mechanics or relativity theory, but not necessarily by understanding it. But
right. Just as a rhetorical tool. Right. So to come back to the issue of science, right? We've all heard, Einstein relativity theory, right? Well, you just glom onto relativity. And then from the uninformed, humanities-educated, right, perspective, right, that sounds like relativism. Of course, it isn't, right? Or Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Oh, incompleteness. So that sounds like us too, right? Or chaos mathematics, right, and so forth. So it then just becomes a semantics issue, but it's really just a rhetorical strategy, I think, as you're suggesting, by people who don't really know the science, right, very well. But there is a darker streak here. I mean, the flip side of if your theory is not going the way you want it to go, how do you handle that? The flip side of that is that Marxism and socialism, right, more broadly, part of its fervor, right, comes from being critical of free market capitalism, the sins of free markets as they see them. And part of Marxism, of course, was making predictions, right, that capitalism was going to get worse and worse, and then ultimately fail and implode, and out of that, right, would come the revolution. And there's then an issue of, it's not only that by the time we get to the 1950s, the socialist intellectuals can see that there are serious troubles with their theory, but they also can look at the relatively free market capitalist nations around the world. The United States, Canada, most of the Western European nations as well, and they can see that the countries that have gone more free market are all flourishing, right, and doing really well. And then again, psychologically, how does that fit, right? When you have spent a significant amount of your intellectual career invested in being bitterly and violently opposed, right, to that movement. I would put it this way, if you just put it on a personal level, suppose you think of the person you hated the most in high school, right, or in middle school, right, who was kind of, you just didn't like this person, you didn't like you, right, and then you go to your high school reunion 20 years later, right, and right, you're working your dead-end job, right, that you hate, and you're just going through your second divorce, right, and then your hated rival, right, shows up, right, in a beautiful car with a beautiful spouse and clearly is, a multi-millionaire and flourishing, right? So it's not just that you are despairing about where your life is right now. It's just, ugh, I hate that guy, right? And that also, of course, is the way it was in the 1950s and the 1960s, because after World War II, the liberal capitalist countries, they picked themselves up, They started producing TVs, everybody had a car, they're taking vacations, life was pretty good, right? And that's a problem for the far left.
So the dark streak becomes, in a way,
Yes.
that they are not happy with their lives, but they are alienated or they have false consciousness.
Yeah, that's part of it, right? But then also anybody whose life is not like theirs becomes a hated symbol, and you want to attack that hated symbol. Now, again, we go back to Nietzsche, right? And I quote Nietzsche right at this point here about the psychology of failure, right, and how that manifests itself. Again, that's a controversial part of the book, and I've taken some heat for that, but you can plunge into that if you're interested.
If we should just dwell on a couple of the contradictory discourses of modern postmodernism or contemporary postmodernism.
Yeah. Okay.
Something that strikes me or struck me the first time I tried to read Derrida, I don't know why I did it, but was that if everything is language and discourse, why should I take what he's writing seriously?
Right.
So I mean, if in a sense, which you also pointed out, if all truth is relative, how do we know that postmodernism is saying how things are?
Right.
Another thing we spoke about just before the introduction, which strikes is if all cultures are relative, then how come that Western culture is the worst or bad?
That's right.
And values, all values are subjective. Your values are yours, mine, but your racism is bad. Sexism is bad.
Right.
Although I recognize all people are equal, but autochthonous people are in a way better because they live a more autochthonous life.
Right.
How do we cope with these contradictions, or are they just Hegelian nonsense talk, or are they serious in a way that some things are meant, or are they just Machiavellian statements of techniques of dominance?
All right, that's a good question. That's a really hard question, right? Now, philosophically, right, any theory that starts to play around with skepticism, right, or relativism is immediately plunged into, right, paradoxes, right? So if you're a skeptic, then you say nobody knows anything, right? But that sounds like a knowledge claim, and it sounds like a pretty audacious knowledge claim because you're saying nobody, right, in the entire universe, right, knows anything. Or if you say all truths are relative, well, is that a truth? That gets included, right, and so on. All right, so there is, right, a legitimate issue about how one can even formulate skepticism and relativism without immediately collapsing into kind of self-contradictory, right, paradox, right, and so forth. But nonetheless, the logic of their position is to say that we do have to be skeptical about any claims of knowledge, because from their perspective, they've looked at the major candidates. They've looked at the faith traditions. Doesn't work, right? They've looked at the reason tradition. Doesn't work. And then they go through all of them, and then from their perspective, it's just, it seems like there are no candidates, so skepticism is the default position. But the second part of what you were saying is where I think things get a little more interesting, because there is an inconsistency in the way skepticism and relativism are used, right? And one way of reading postmodernism, obviously rhetoric is very important there, is to see that the postmodernists are not really interested in truth or what's right, but rather they see language and intellectualizing as just part of a rhetorical strategy, right? That language has a certain amount of power to influence people, not necessarily by coming to know truth and then acting on the basis of that truth, but just because we are socially linguistic creatures. And so if you use language and rhetoric the right way, then you can direct people in the way that you want. So you can say all sorts of things, right, that under the cold microscope might seem self-contradictory, right, and so forth, and that won't really matter, right? What matters is whether you're using that language achieves the goal that you want to set for yourself. So an example would be, you think of lawyers in a courtroom. I mean, there's two types of lawyers. There are lawyers who believe that there is truth, that there is justice, and that the whole point of the legal system is to figure out what the truth is and to do the just thing. And of course, that's really hard, and sometimes we mess it up, but that's what we are striving to do. But there's another kind of lawyer who will say There is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as justice. Instead, the courtroom really is just a vehicle for different factions to engage in a power struggle. And it doesn't matter what strategies you use as long as your side prevails in this power struggle. And so if you're a lawyer, right, you will make up facts, right? Or you can use contradictory rhetorical strategies as long as it wins.
That is nihilism, in a way.
It is, yes.
But I don't say it in a normative way, it's just describing it.
Yes, it is.
It's just rhetorics from me as well.
Yes.
No, in any case, how come then that we don't accept accept the other type of nihilism, saying that the white race is more superior?
Ah, okay.
Or let's kill all the lawyers, and I think that's
kill all the what?
The lawyers. I think that's from Shakespeare, Richard III.
Oh, all of the lawyers.
Yes.
Oh, yes. First we start with they're just at the top of the list.
Yes, first we start with the lawyers. Yeah. So
Okay.
how come those statements are not as equal as any
Right.
other statement? How come that there are no postmodernists on the far right?
Right.
Or conservative postmodernists, or,
Right.
or liberal,
Yeah.
whatever?
Yeah, that is certainly as part of the strategy. If we say, for example, that there is no such thing as truth, there is no such thing as justice, there's just right opinions, then it does seem an implication that anybody's truth is as good as anybody else's, right? Or anybody's value system, right, is as good as anybody else's. And of course, that could be a consistent, right, postmodern strategy. But then, as you're pointing out, and I do talk about this to some extent in the book, is that the postmodernists don't rest themselves content with that, because they do have persistent targets, right? They do want to say that John Locke was wrong, right? They do want to say that capitalism is immoral. They do want to say that racism is intolerable, right, and so forth. So you do have this relativism, which should lead you to not making any judgments at all, combined with a lot of judgmentalism, right, in various respects. And so your question is, how do you combine those two?
Yes.
Right.
And how do you live with yourself?
Okay. There is no way to combine them intellectually. Right? I think the way you live with yourself, though, is by thinking, if there is no truth, if the world really is just a power struggle, it's dog eat dog. I don't know if you have the same expression in Swedish, right? If you really believe that all is fair in love and war and politics, then the way you live with yourself is to say, I did not make the world the way it is, but I'm just going to make sure that my side prevails. And any rhetorical strategy, any weapon is usable in that strategy. Mm-hmm. But then the persistent targets, so this is, I think, where the left politics, right, comes in, because typically, right, leftism comes out of a view. Part of the value component is the idea that society is a matter of the strong versus the weak, the rich versus the poor, the privileged versus the underprivileged, and it's this ongoing conflict. And these guys have won. The privileged, the rich, and the powerful have, for centuries, right, dominated. And as a member of the left, you see yourself as being on the side of the underdog, right, the poor, right, the underprivileged, and so forth. And so then it would become, okay, it's justifiable to use all sorts of strategies against the rich, the powerful, the whites, the capitalists, right, and so forth. It's just the way the game is played. We didn't make the rules, but we're just going to use these tools.
So relativism
on our
becomes
side.
relativism becomes more or less a cover, or
Yes.
as we say sometimes said in Arabic, taqiya, the right to lie in order to deceive your enemies.
That's right. Yes.
Questions and comments from the audience, very short and brief. Anyone who dares to enter this discussion, well, please go ahead. Let's start here and then go back to Ingmar at the end.
My name is Dan Theorin, and I'm a legal advisor and a composer. And I read this Swedish translation here where you point out Kant as the major bad guy.
Yes.
And what I have learned, and I'm not be totally updated on Newton and Kant and Leibniz and so forth, but
Did you say Leibniz?
what?
Did you say Leibniz?
Leibniz, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah,
All right.
yeah. Sorry. And for me, Newton, he was quite a big mathematician, wasn't he? I mean, he was quite...
Invented calculus. So
Yeah, yeah.
That Leibniz did that as well. So
Okay, so I mean, so this was very important
Yes.
for the Enlightenment and all the progress and stuff like
Right.
that. But one thing that Newton didn't really deal with was law issues and humanistic things, you know. And Kant's idea was to lift up the reasoning in the human mind, because I don't see how you can find a legal thesis in analyzing a stone, for instance, you know.
Right.
So I mean,
I'm
maybe
going to
there are
cut you short there
different...
because I'm going to cut you short there
Okay.
because some others will also ask questions. But I got your point in a sense that I actually was going to bring up Kant at the end, but I say that well, this will not be a philosophical professional discussion per se.
Right.
I enjoyed very much this thing about Kant, but I know that it's very controversial.
Yes.
You will have the ability to answer and defend your position on attacking Kant.
Sure.
Valdemar.
Hello, I'm Valdemar Ingdahl, and I'm going to be brief about this, namely to ask you about the first postmodernist, namely that it's a name that has been given to an Austrian economist, Friedrich Hayek, namely that there is a skeptical tradition in the liberal, libertarian thought, going through Popper, etc., and there are points, not where the two traditions, the two skeptical, liberal, socialist traditions actually blend, but they do meet. You can see it in Foucault's discussions about biopolitics and his comments on Hayek. So, what's your take on it?
Yeah.
I actually brought Hayek's The Studies in the Abuse of Reason and Popper's Power of Historicism just to make your point.
Okay.
I know it was coming. Last question from Jan Sunnesson, and then we'll or comment, and then we'll get
Thank you.
back to you.
Okay.
Do you
All right.
remember the
Yeah.
issues? You
Yes.
do. Hmm?
Kant, Hayek.
Yes.
Another early postmodernist would be Georges Sorel, and then Henri Bergson, who had this vitalist philosophy. And I would say that Lyotard especially, but also mostly Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault are actually anarchists. They're not Marxists or socialists. They go back to a vitalist sense of life force. So it's more anarchism that they advocate as a left-wing strategy rather than any socialist, Marxist, or communist. Do you have any comment on that? Because that goes back to Georges Sorel.
All right, so we have
Kant,
Hayek,
Foucault,
Sorel,
Sorel.
Foucault. Okay. Kant. Yes. If you look at the Kant literature, there are three major interpretations, right, of Kant. And it's just, right, the usual academic, right, discourse. So my interpretation is the skeptical, it's one of the mainstream, right, interpretations of Kant. But I do see him not as being a total postmodernist, right? Because in some respects, I would say in secondary and derivative respects, he had a lot of respect for reason. The only point I make right about Kant is that he most sophisticatedly set the breach between the subjective and the object and made the powerful arguments that said you can't do that. And once you make that principled separation, then you enter into a different territory. And it took several generations, right, of implications. But it is a fairly mainstream history of philosophy position right now of historians and philosophers saying that really, if you want to understand what's going on in contemporary philosophy for the last 2 centuries, it pretty much all comes out of Kant, right? Kant set the framework and we're all working within that framework. So that would just be my Kant point. On the politics side, I go back to Rousseau. I start my story with Rousseau as one of the leading left-wing thinkers, and there's an evolution there. Okay.
He was really a bad guy.
As you don't have, so as I indicated to you, he just set the ground. He wasn't
Yes.
that bad guy, so to speak. He was more...
Well,
Well,
let's save Kant.
Yeah, there's a whole lot more there. Hayek, that's a very perceptive point. One of the very good books I read about 2 years ago was by a socialist named Theodore Berksock. I recommend this book. It's called Socialism After Hayek. And what he does very refreshingly for socialists is to say that we socialists have been ignoring the free market thinkers for a long time. We need to take them seriously, and Hayek is one of the guys we do need to take seriously. And so I thought that was refreshing, but also he does make the very perceptive arguments going down the road that you're talking about, that if you look at Hayek, particularly in Hayek's theory of knowledge and his epistemological points, you see a number of points that are in common, right, with the postmodernists. And Burksack's argument is if you take those and you follow them out consistently, then Hayek is going to end up being a kind of postmodernist. You're also right to say that within the broad classical libertarian tradition, there are any number of sub-traditions, and one of the sub-traditions has embraced a certain kind of skepticism. David Hume is in this tradition. John Stuart Mill very lightly brushes up against this tradition, right, as well. They say that the reason why we need to have a free society is that really nobody has a lock on what the absolute truth is, and so nobody's in a position to tell other people what they should be doing with their lives. So I certainly don't want to deny that some kinds of skepticism can't be made compatible with classical liberalism. Or that if you take those skeptical traditions and push them very hard, that you won't end up in postmodernism. Now, Sorel, right, and then Foucault. Sorel, I think, is an important thing. I think the problem with Sorel is that he was just born at the wrong time for him. That he was a brilliant thinker, but he was early 20th century, and at that time, the left was totally enamored with Marxist socialism. So all of this vitalist, irrationalist, non-scientific understandings of human nature and the movements that are coming out of that, he was just largely ignored. Right? And it wasn't until the 50s and 1960s that he was rehabilitated, precisely because the Marxist tradition ran into serious difficulties and left thinkers were looking for theoreticians to reorient it. Now, as for the anarchism in Foucault, I think a small anarchism, I think that certainly is true, but you can't deny that he was a member of the French Communist Party in the 1950s. Right? That's pretty doctrinaire left-right for a while. Now, he did break with the French Communist Party in the 1950s. The Stalinist hardline was too much for him. He drafted around, but he became a kind of Maoist, right, in the 1960s. But that was a Maoist in combination with these vitalist and anarchistic elements that you're talking about as well. So there certainly is a more complicated story. All right, and it's not the case that all of the postmodernists are, monolithically doctrinaire, one particular version of far-left politics. My only point is that they're all hanging out at the one end of the spectrum.
One thing about Foucault is, if I remember it right, and probably someone in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong, is that actually his PhD thesis was not accepted at the Uppsala University because it was found too unscientific and unreasonable. I think it was Madness and Civilization. Well, we have actually come to the end. Lisa Abramovich, should I be nice to you? And of course I should. And because you were the fourth person in the room who wanted to ask a very brief question, and then we will round up.
All right. I am not a philosopher. I'm just reading the pages and working in a difficult field. For me, a postmodernist, writing and living and speaking today, they endorse verifiable facts if they speak for their views. And if it doesn't, if they don't have any facts, then they become relativist, and they say, well, we can't know, there are different narratives. One is as good as the other, one is as valid as the other. So sometimes they actually endorse verifiable facts, and sometimes when they are not sure or when they are over, shall we say, persuaded, then
you have to have the microphone towards your mouth.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I was speaking loud enough. Okay.
Yes, I heard though. Yes,
ranting about.
Thank you. But I think that's one of the points you are making in the book as well. That it's a question of the smorgasbord, that where sometimes you can choose facts and sometimes you can just say that facts don't matter.
Right. Yeah, and so the phenomenon you're pointing out is exactly right. But what that just means is that it's not a principled commitment to facts or to reason. It's an unprincipled opportunism. Right? And I do think that opportunism as a rhetorical strategy is a part of postmodernism. So good point.
So thank you very much. And my final sayings to your recommendation to you would be actually read the book. And once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Very nice. Very nice.
Boken finns att köpa här nere och vi tar kort.